So, hello and welcome back to A Tale of Genetic Code. And let's just get started. So, today's topic is Ploidy, and this is quite interesting. And I think everything in genetics is interesting, and this is especially so because you can just see the variety of ways in which nature has adapted uh, even single cell to multicellular organisms with respect to the amount of genetic content that is present in these cells, and that is quite fascinating. So let's just get started. Before that, this is the tree of life that we had seen previously, and this section represents the creatures which we define as not living by crafting a definition which essentially leads to that effect. And when we discuss about life, it is about these organisms that we talk, right? And today we are talking about ploidy, which basically refers to the number of sets of chromosomes that an organism has. And this term is most commonly used in plant and animal genetics, whereas most of the bacteria actually have a single chromosome. And because a single chromosome by definition is haploid, and that the bacteria themselves, despite having a single chromosome, have some genes in multiple copies. The term copy number is more commonly used in bacterial genetics, and the term ploidy is more referred to with respect to animal and plant genetics, right? So we know that humans are diploid. We have 23 pairs, 46 chromosomes, and that this is essential not just for having an extra set of genes in case one goes haywire, but also for sexual reproduction, where the males and females form separate gametes and then they combine by the process of sexual reproduction to form a zygote, which then gives rise to a whole complete organism, right? But there are several organisms, including several modern day crops, which are polyploids, and several lower organisms whose main part of the life cycle is actually haploid. And that is actually quite interesting, and we'll be seeing that in detail. And before we proceed, the natural, we will see just one example of Triticum aestivum, which is basically the common wheat, the bread wheat that we use. And you can see that this is the plant that we consume. And this is actually not a naturally occurring plant, but was generated by cultivation of plants, a hybridization of plants, which led to a hexaploidy. So, like we are so comfortable with diploid cells, but the cells that we consume, the staple of so many cultures, it is actually a hexaploid plant, which is formed by hybridization of these two. So this is icon wheat and goat grass, and you can see that it gives rise to a variety of different hybrids, and then these hybrids are again hybridized with another weed, which is Triticum toshi, to give rise to these hexaploid plants that are actually quite big and their yield is much greater. So the as the number of genes in the cell increases, the size of the cells also increases because there are so many more growth factors and protein products that are given out of those genes in the different chromosomes. And now you have a larger cell, a larger plant, and a better yield, which is good for everybody, right? And before we proceed, probably we should just resolve the difference between ploidy and homology. So the concept of homology will only arise when the number of sets of chromosomes is more than one, right? Because when you have more than one chromosome in which the genes are present in the same order, and the the genes that are present also are complementary to each other. So, for example, if you take these two chromosomes, this pair of chromosomes, you have the same genes in the same order on each of these chromosomes. And note that each gene is represented by a different color, but it is also represented by a different number. So there's A1 here and A2 here. What that means is that, you can have the same sets of chromosomes on both the same set of genes on both the chromosomes, but you need not actually have the same allele, and where allele actually refers to a different version of the same gene, which is probably different from the first one in one or two nucleotides. And that might not be critical for the function of that gene, or it might be, but any variant of a given gene can be called an allele. So when you have different chromosomes possessing different variants of this one gene, it is called different alleles. And basically, the concept of homologous chromosome just means that there are multiple copies of a chromosome which contain genes in the same order, right? So that is how ploidy and homology are different. Ploidy is just sets of chromosomes, and homology means out of this set, which are the chromosomes that have identical sequence of genes, right? That being said, let's go to haploid. So haploid is a single set of chromosomes, and like we had given an example of a bacterium containing a single chromosome. So by definition, it is a haploid. And even it's not just restricted to bacteria, right? Even higher organisms, in fact, even humans have a haploid phase of life cycle where, like I had described earlier, the germ cells fuse to form the germ cells, which are themselves haploid, fuse to form a zygote, which restores the diploid number of chromosomes, which then forms into a human animal or any other animal for that matter, with several exceptions, which we'll be going into. And that being said about animals, there are several plants whose major part of the life cycle is actually haploid. And we can see that organisms like mosses, so these green sheets of mosses that we see around, they're actually haploid plants. So they come under the category of non-vascular flowerless plants, and their predominant form is haploid, and in fact, the gametophyte generation or the gametophyte phase of their life cycle. And so are liverworts. So there we had seen like just a sheet of very homogeneous looking, very small plant-like creatures. But here you can see these very macroscopic leaf-like structures, which are reminiscent of normal plants that we are more familiar with. But these are actually haploid cells. Every cell in these plants is haploid, and again, this is a gametophyte dominant life cycle. And while this is common in lower organisms, including yeasts, where it's very difficult to differentiate between a haploid and a diploid cell, and if you grow them both in a culture, they will actually grow the same, and they'll grow to be the similar looking plant. So it is so while this phenomenon of haploidy is very common in lower organisms, it has become very restricted as evolution progressed, and as far as animals are concerned, there is so far we have found only one insect that is haploid, and that is called this Brevipalpus phonesis. So uh, this might prompt a question actually, because the difference between males and females in animals is based on which sex chromosomes they have, right? Like the males have X and Y, and females have X and X. And I am saying that there's an organism which is purely haploid. Then how would this organism reproduce, right? Because you require the different sexes and uh, you know, the whole sexual reproduction part, which we will be discussing in future videos. But this has a very interesting way of differentiating its males from females. So there is a bacterium, the endosymbiotic bacterium, which causes feminization of males to become females. That is crazy, right? So we have a haploid organism which can become a female if it has this endosymbiotic bacterium. So that is how uh, crazy things get in nature. So these are some interesting parts about haploid creatures. Now let's move on to polyploid. So polyploid we have just seen about Triticum aestivum, uh, and but there are many more interesting examples and really crazy ones. So we'll just get into those. But for the sake of definition, uh, haploid was possessing a single set of chromosomes, and polyploid means possessing more than two sets of chromosomes, right? This is slightly erroneous here. It should be more than two sets of chromosomes. And diploid is what we take by default, the human condition. In fact, let me just change this to avoid confusion. Two sets of chromosome. Chromosome. Yeah. So possessing more than two sets of chromosomes is what polyploid is. And the human condition is diploid in the somatic cells, which means they contain exactly two sets of chromosomes. And yeah, so like I had said, that most of the lower plants and bacteria have a very predominant haploid existence, whereas most of the more evolved recent plants, including all the flowering plants, have a lot of polyploid state. So there are hexaploid, tetraploid uh, plants. That means they contain those many sets of chromosomes, right? So, like I had alluded to earlier, polyploid plants have a larger cell size and they are themselves larger. So, what that probably does, and especially because the number of genes that these plants possess is also great. Like, for example, humans have 20 to 25,000 genes, right? But these plants have like 40 to 50,000 genes, and we are like apparently so much more complex than a plant that sits and does nothing except photosynthesis. Uh, Please uh, forgive the way I'm speaking about plants, but if you just look at it that way, that the plant is just performing photosynthesis. That is a very important thing, but that is apparently all that is doing, and we are composing poetry, we are building structures, we are writing code. We are doing all these things, and we have like less than half the number of genes that they have. And probably that is because of their sedentary nature, that they need to be very robust in uh, you know going through the harsh environment that nature can provide, and they need to grow and thrive under those conditions. And probably that is the reason why they have so many extra genes. And we actually don't know the real reason, but this is one hypothesis that has been floated around. And polyploidy is very unusual in animals because, like I was saying, there are several dosage sensitive genes where, having a single number is also deleterious and having more than two is also deleterious. But recently, like just 25 years back, we have found one rat, uh, that is one mammal that we know of in Argentina, that is like polyploid. That is tetraploid, right? So there are, if you want to think of examples of plants, then even coffee, something as staple as coffee and something as staple as wheat, these are polyploid. And in coffee, the N, so we are representing the haploid as one N, and then depending on the number of copies it has, we uh, add that as a prefix. So 8N means it has eight copies of its haploid genome, right? So we have all these varieties of copies of coffee, right, from 2N to 8N, and we have already discussed about Triticum aestivum. And then you come across, so I had said earlier that these really primitive organisms like bacteria have very less number of chromosomes. But there's an exception here, which is the hyperthermophilic bacteria, basically the archaea. They live in such harsh environments that it is very easy for them to get their DNA damaged, right? So having extra chromosomes, having extra copies of their genes is critical for their survival. So you see polyploidy in these organisms. So let's just see these extremophiles. So we have heard about Thermus thermophilus, which is a organism that thrives in really hot uh, puddles of water, like we had seen in the previous video. But then there's this other organism called Deinococcus radiodurans. Basically, it's a single-cell organism which is extremely resistant to radiation, and again, it requires multiple sets of chromosomes so that it can reconstruct any damage that it incurs from the environment by using the other normal copy, right? So that is what this text also says in more words. But then there is another very, very interesting uh, symbiosis here. So we have seen this fish in the movie Finding Dory and Finding Nemo, and this is a surgeonfish, which is what Dory is. And there's a symbiotic relationship of this surgeonfish with a bacterium called Epilopicium ficiloni, and that is the largest bacterium that we know of. And it is so large that even eukaryotic cells appear small in comparison. In fact, this single cell of this bacterium is visible to the naked eye. It might be as large as half a millimeter, right? And to just compare its size with the bacteria which we are more familiar with, like the E. coli, which is just 1 micron in size, right? It's just 1 micron in width and maybe 2 to 3 micron in length. But just look at this, it is 500 microns long. That is so great. And this is not just the only crazy thing about this bacterium, but this bacterium has copies of its genome in the thousands. Isn't that weird? Like, why would a single celled organism require 1,000 copies of its genome? We really don't know why that is the case, but one another interesting feature of this organism is that it has viviparity, which means that its daughter cells grow inside of it and then they burst out when the mother cell dies. So this is the amount of strangeness that exists in nature, and this is what I wanted to share with you today. So thank you, and I'll catch you in another video. Bye.